Welcome everyone to AGI's GeoWebinar series. My name is Leila Gonzalez and I'll be moderating today's Geoscience Currents discussion webinar, Minorities, Temporary Residents, and Gender Parity in the Geosciences. So today's talk, we're going to be reviewing some of the most recent data that was in our recent set of currents from currents number 30 onward to the one that was just released yesterday. We'll be talking about trends in higher education, looking primarily at degrees conferred, but as well as some data for enrollments at four-year universities. We'll be looking at minority participation, and by that I mean Hispanic, African American, and Native American participation in geoscience degrees, as well as comparing that against the broader trends for all degrees as well as other science and engineering disciplines. We'll also be looking at non-U.S. resident trends, participation in U.S. universities, as well as gender parity. And then we'll go forward and we'll look at trends in the workforce, looking again, working kind of backwards here. So we'll be transitioning from looking at trends in higher education and gender parity, moving forward to looking at trends in gender parity within the workforce, as well as minority participation. And then we'll be wrapping up there and taking your questions at the end after the presentation's concluded. So let's go ahead and move on here. First we'll start with minority participation. And what we see here is we see degrees and enrollments for underrepresented minorities since 1976 for selected years. What you see on the y-axis is the percentage of enrollment or degrees, and then that's by years. And the darker colors represent the enrollments, the lighter colors represent the degrees. And what we can see here is that in 2008, minorities comprised about 23% of total enrollment for all degrees conferred, or all disciplines, as well as 18% of total degrees conferred. Now, minority participation rates at four-year universities have been increasing since the mid-70s. And what we can see here, if we look at by minority group, African American enrollments increased from 8.5% in 1976 to almost 13% in 2008, whereas degrees conferred to African Americans have increased from 6.4% in 76 to about almost 10%, 9.8% in 2008. Looking at Hispanics here in the yellow, we can see that enrollments increased from just about 2.4% in 1976 to 9% in 2008, while degrees conferred to Hispanics increased from 2% to 7.2% in that same period of time. Additionally, if we look at Native American enrollments and degrees conferred, enrollments have increased from about 0.5% in 76 to almost 1% in 2008, and degrees conferred increased from 0.3% to 0.7% over that same period of time. Now let's go ahead and look at, now this is for all degrees, so this is all degrees combined by all degree levels as well. So if we break this out and we look at, break this out by degree level, we can see some different trends showing up here. And what I've done here is the solid lines are bachelor's degrees, the dashed lines are master's degrees, and then the dotted lines are doctoral degrees. And blue represents African Americans, yellow represents Hispanics, and again, red here represents Native Americans. And we do see some upward trends for African Americans and Hispanics since the mid-90s. There is some variation there, for sure. Okay, and then we see some flattening out here in the last few years for bachelor's degrees for African Americans, and some flattening in the trend here for Hispanics since the early part of the century. And the other note here is that for Native American, we see pretty much a flatline trend hovering between 0.5% and almost 1% over this whole period of time. Okay, so moving on here, let's take a look at percentage of degrees conferred to minorities between 1997 and 2006. Now what we looked at here is we grouped those years together and then we looked at the percentages so that we could compare geoscience degrees by degree level compared with some of the broader STEM fields are the science, technology, and engineering and mathematics fields, as well as some of the other fields within the physical sciences, such as chemistry and physics. And we can see here on this graph that for this set of years, at the undergraduate level, just under 6% of geoscience degrees were conferred to minorities. And at the graduate level, almost 4% for master's degrees and just over 3.5% for doctoral degrees. And if we look at the trends next to these other disciplines here, we can see that the geosciences falls behind those other disciplines, definitely for the bachelor's degree level and master's degree level, and for most of them for the doctoral level. Although compared to some of the other disciplines such as physics, underrepresented degrees conferred to underrepresented minorities at the doctoral level for the geosciences is slightly higher. Now looking here, this is another graph again to look at geoscience degrees conferred to minorities. And this is looking up to 2008 from 2003, and what we've done here is we've combined all the degree levels together so we can see this trend as to degrees conferred to underrepresented minorities over that time frame. So we have a little bit more recent data here, and we can see that there is fluctuation and some increase over the past few years in degrees conferred to minorities in the geosciences. However, we still have a ways to go to reach those national benchmarks for sure. And if we look by degree level for 2008, we can see that Hispanics, for the underrepresented minority groups, Hispanics comprise the larger proportion of underrepresented minorities that are receiving geoscience degrees at all levels here. Now let's go ahead and move on and look at non-U.S. residents graduating from U.S. geoscience programs. And this is coming from our Geoscience Currents number 32. What we see here is that for geoscience degrees, which is highlighted here in yellow, we can see that back between 1995 and 2000, about 25% of graduate degrees from the geosciences were conferred to non-U.S. residents. And in the past few years, that has increased to about 30%. So the geosciences relative to other science and engineering disciplines confers more degrees than, say, for biological sciences or social sciences, but still the percentage of degrees conferred to non-U.S. residents is less than some of the other disciplines listed here, such as computer sciences, engineering, and physical sciences. Now let's go ahead and break this down and break out the graduate degrees by master's degrees and doctoral degrees, as well as look at geosciences, splitting that out from geoscience engineering disciplines such as petroleum engineering, mining engineering, environmental engineering. Those fall under that geoscience engineering discipline, which is shown here in orange. And what we can see here is that the decrease for the geosciences, which is indicated in yellow here, we can see that this decreased from 20% to 30% of U.S. geoscience degrees conferred to non-U.S. residents. This really reflects the growth in U.S. citizens graduating primarily from geology and oceanography programs. We also do see this increasing trend here in geoscience engineering from about 27% back in 95 to about 40% today, and there was definitely a peak here between 2003 and 2006. What we see here is that this reflects the decrease in U.S. citizens graduating primarily from environmental engineering programs, and as well as a steady increase in non-U.S. residents who are graduating primarily from petroleum and environmental engineering programs. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see this is basically numbers. You can see this solid lines are U.S. citizens, dashed lines are non-U.S. residents, and you can see this trend in U.S. citizens versus non-U.S. citizens. That going back to the previous slide, we can see those percentages based on those numbers. Another thing that's interesting to note here is relative to the other disciplines where geoscience engineering and geosciences, the percentage of degrees at the master's level conferred to non-U.S. residents fall compared to the other disciplines. So we're going to move ahead here and look at doctoral degrees. And what we can see here is, again, there's an increase from 30% to 37% since 95, which is primarily driven by an increase in the number of non-U.S. resident geoscience doctoral graduates since 2000. And that's, again, here in the yellow. And then if we look at geoscience engineering, see this fluctuation between about 50 and 60% over this period of time since 1995 to 2008. And what that is showing is that we're seeing this fluctuation in part due to the trends here in U.S. residents, as well as this increase overall in, the fluctuations for the geoscience doctoral degrees here are shown are primarily due to the fluctuations in U.S. citizen participation, as well as the increase here in non-U.S. residents. And we do see this fluctuation between 50 to 60% based on the trends that we see here in geoscience engineering, U.S. citizens in the solid line here, and dashed lines representing the non-U.S. residents. So let's go ahead and move on here and look at gender parity in the geosciences, at least at the degree conferral level. Now we can see that these are numbers that were published up through 2009. We're going to be running our 2010 numbers, so we're going to be looking at how these trends change with the most recent increase in enrollments and degrees, since we did see some substantial increases this year, both in enrollments and degrees, and that was back in one of our earlier geoscience currents released this month. But we can see that the percentage of geoscience doctorates conferred to women has increased by 5% since 2007, up to 43%, while the percentage of bachelor's and master's degrees conferred to women has remained steady around 43 and 44% respectively over the same time period. So we'll see how these numbers change when we pull the data for the 2010 enrollments and degrees conferred. Now we're going to go ahead and move into looking at gender parity in the workforce, as well as looking at minority participation in the workforce and seeing how that matches up against the degrees conferred and looking at how these trends have changed over time. So what we can see here is data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we can see that the percentage of women in environmental science and geoscience occupations has not exceeded 30% since 2003. There's been some fluctuation over the past few years, but we still hit that 29.9 or 29.8% as our top mark there. Whereas if you look at the percentage of women in all occupations, highlighted by the gray bars here, we can see that it's hitting around 47% over that same time period. So we are falling behind these national benchmarks here, and we haven't seen any upward pressure to increase those percentages over this time frame. Now let's go ahead and move forward and take a look at some of the data here from NSF to take a look at a little higher resolution here. And what we can see here is that in comparison to other science and engineering disciplines, the percentage of women in geoscience occupations is only higher than that than women in engineering occupations. And we have the geosciences highlighted here in yellow at 16%. Now if we look at more detailed data from 2006, and this is coming out of the CSTAT 2006 database, we can see that the percentage of women in different types of geoscience occupations does vary, with the highest percentage as oceanographers at 28%, and the lowest percentage in mining and geological engineering occupations at 2%, and variation among the gradient there, as you can see. Now, looking at gender parity in the geoscience academic workforce, now this data is from 2008. It's from one of our previous currents, currents number 9. And we'll be updating this soon with the 2010 data to see how these trends have changed, if any, from data from our Directory of Geoscience departments. You can see that females make up a total of 14.2% of all tenure-track faculty in geoscience departments, and compared to all science and engineering fields, women in tenure-track positions in all science and engineering fields make up 28%. So we are falling behind that benchmark for sure. And in the geosciences, women comprise 18.6% of non-tenure track positions. And as of 2008, that level of female participation in faculty positions has not changed substantially in recent years. And again, like I said, we'll be updating this with the 2010 data to see how and if these percentages have changed over the last 2 years. Now let's take a look at underrepresented minorities and their participation in the workforce. And here is a slide, again, generated from data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, looking at underrepresented minority participation in environmental science and geoscience occupations, highlighted here in yellow, versus in all occupations, which is designated here in the gray bars. And we can see that for the whole U.S. workforce, minority participation increased from about 23% back in 2003 to about 25% in 2009. And this increase primarily was driven by a growth in Hispanic participation rates from 12.6% to 14%. Now, in comparison, the percentage of underrepresented minorities in environmental science and geoscience occupations has varied between 4.7%